Hello there, this is Alan Murphy from New Barn Christian Fellowship in Dartford in Kent in the United Kingdom. We've been doing some Hebrew word studies on the women of the Bible, and today we're going to look at the first part of Hannah. That's in 1 Samuel, so if you've got a Bible and you want to turn to 1 Samuel, and the way that I'm really conducting these studies is to pick out a few English words from the passage and to look at the Hebrew meaning of those words, and then to expand the English meanings of those Hebrew words, because I've found it gives us a lot more clarification and teaching and understanding when we're actually able to look at the Hebrew words. So 1 Samuel chapter 1, I'm just going to read a few verses in chapter 1, and from verse 6, the earlier verses give us a little bit about Elkanah, the husband, and the children, and a little bit of their history, and yeah, so we'll go from verse 6. And it says, and because the Lord had closed her womb, that's Hannah, that's not Penina, that's Hannah, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year, and whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. In verse 8, Elkanah, her husband, would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downcast? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? So the question is, and we do have a bit of a dilemma here, and Hannah has a dilemma as well, because we know that God promises things. He promises things to you and me because he's a covenant keeping God. Okay, and in Corinthians it says God's promises are yea and amen, yes and amen, in Jesus Christ. So you would have thought, wouldn't you, that every time God promises something, that it would happen. But it doesn't always work that way, and it's not as simple as that, because God isn't always simple. He can be quite complicated, and there are things which God has mentioned to me and promised me over the years that have never happened, and possibly for you too. And I just want us to see and to be encouraged that if you felt that God has promised you something, or you can't see any reason why you shouldn't be enjoying this or that blessing or that situation, then don't write God off or get angry, but try and understand what his ways are. And that's what we're going to do today, particularly as we look at Hannah. Now, her name, Hannah, comes from the Hebrew Hanan, and it means to bend or to stoop, to incline, okay, or to lay down to rest. It also means grace, by the way, grace. But there's bend, there's stoop, there's incline, and there's to lay down to rest. So certainly with the first two, to bend and to stoop, that is indicative of when perhaps you are blessing someone, you are giving grace to someone, you are serving someone, you bend and you stoop. And let's not forget that the names of people in the Bible were prophetically given because it either identified the type of person that they will turn out to be, their accomplishments, their achievements, or certainly it would describe an element of their character. like Avram, Abraham, his father of a multitude. And that's clearly what God said. He will be the father of the multitude. And in Romans 4, it says he's the father of our faith, and we follow the faith of Abraham. In Ruth, her name means a friend, and she carries on in her life, and she becomes a friend, doesn't she, to Naomi particularly. So let's bear that in mind, that names in the Bible are something that's descriptive of who we are or descriptive of what we do. So with Hannah, we can see, or hopefully you can see, possibly in this passage and certainly next week, the bending and the stooping that she had to go through, okay? And I don't have time to explain too much about that, but you can meditate that on yourself. But to incline and to lay down to rest. And that's something that we will develop as we go on, the inclining and the laying down to rest. So we're faced with this situation, with this dilemma, where Hannah's name means grace. Now, she either gives that grace or she receives that grace. That's what we just said about the meaning of names. And particularly when you think of someone receiving grace or receiving favor, you expect God's blessing upon their life. And as Christians, because we are in Christ, then we expect, and rightly so, God's favor upon our life. Sometimes it doesn't work out, as we have said, like that. So we need to think about the whys and the wherefores. Now, some people would say, and certainly the thought in Jewish culture and Jewish belief was, if something wasn't going right, then it was usually connected with sin. Now, you remember the blind man in John chapter 9, and the disciples come to Jesus and say, Lord, who sinned? Did he sin? Did his parents sin? Who sinned that he was born blind? And Jesus said, neither. He said, this happened so that the glory of God might be manifest. So if we can think of a situation which is perhaps not going to plan, it's not according to God's promise, seemingly. It's not really so much of a blessing to be, but more of a hardship. Let's think wider about whether God is wanting to teach us something through that situation, and normally and invariably he is. It's not just God's there, we're here, and he gives us blessings. God's more interested in us being shaped and carved and molded into his character and his personality through trials and tribulations and difficult situations, rather than us just getting what we want when we want it. So that is really, really clear. Her barrenness, and you need to listen to this and make a note of this, her barrenness is not linked with sin, it's linked with purpose. Okay, her barrenness is not linked with sin, it's linked with purpose. And then we're hopefully going to see a little bit today how her barrenness is linked with purpose. Now, there's a lovely verse in Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 8. And it speaks about, and I will turn to it because it's worth me reading it. And Hebrews 5 and verse 8, it's a very interesting, Hebrews is an amazing book. It really is. And there are some lovely, lovely things here. But Hebrews 5:8 says something really strange. speaking about Jesus, it says, although he was a son, he learned obedience. Now, you think, well, did Jesus have to learn obedience? Wasn't he obedient all the time? Wasn't part of his DNA and who he was to be obedient, because he was perfect? Yeah. But it says, although he was a son, he learned obedience. It was something he had to learn. It was a process from what he suffered. So can you see that Jesus learnt obedience through what he suffered? And that's how we learn obedience. That's how our faith develops, through suffering. But then it goes on to say something really a bit weird in verse 9. It says, and once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation. Once made perfect. Well, Jesus was perfect. He always was perfect. He didn't become perfect when he was 30 years of age, when he started his ministry. He'd always been perfect. So what does it mean, once made perfect? Well, what I believe it means, and without going into the Greek word, because we're trying to concentrate on our Hebrew word studies, is I believe it means once made ready. You see, Jesus was always perfect, but he wasn't always ready. Jesus' ministry began at the age of 30 years of age for 3 years. He wasn't ready at 25, although he was perfect. He wasn't ready at 20, although he was perfect. God could have released him on the world, or on that area in which he was living, when he was 20 or 25, but he wasn't ready. There were things he still needed to learn. So although he was perfect, he wasn't ready. And that's the situation with Hannah. The situation with Hannah was that through her difficulty, through her barrenness, God was going to be teaching her some lessons. Okay, now it goes on to say, just after our reading, that the Lord, in verse 5, the Lord had closed her womb. Now, one of God's blessings is fruitfulness of the womb. God said to Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply. So it was in God's heart for Hannah and her husband to have children. In fact, the other wife, Peninnah, she had children. So why couldn't why couldn't Hannah have children? And for some reason, God shut up her womb. Now, it's not a surprise, really, that the word in Hebrew, the sagar, it's just a development of shut up. It means to shut in, to stop, or to close up. Okay? Now, we have to get this clear. There was no medical reason why she didn't have children. Okay? She wasn't conceiving because there was a problem with her body. There was no problem with her body. God was involved. God was dealing with it. God was behind the scenes. And what tends to happen is that both in your life and in my life, we have to understand the timing of God, that God has a plan and he has a timing for you and for me to experience certain things. So just as we said that Jesus wasn't ready, Hannah wasn't ready to give birth to Samuel. Okay, she wasn't in the right place. And so she needed to go through situations. In verse 10, for example, it says, in bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much, she prayed, she was bitter. She was irritated with this other woman. So her heart was set, if I can put it this way, on just having children. And there's a lot of ladies in the Bible who just had children. And although they were special because they were humans and they were loved and they were children, we don't read that they had a special purpose. In fact, for the other ladies, for Peninnah's sons and daughters, in verse 4, it says, he would give portions of meat to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. Now, we don't read the names of her sons and daughters. We don't read about their achievements. So Peninnah just had children. Precious though they were to the family, they were not, I believe, in the same category of calling and ministry and being set apart as Samuel was. Samuel was someone who God had a special calling for, and that's why we read his name. That's why these two books, 1 and 2 Samuel, are called after him, because he was special. He was anointed. And Hannah was not in that position as a person, in her heart, with her attitude, to be able to bear Samuel at that particular point in time. Now, I don't know what you think about that, but I've been in a situation in my previous church when I was, this is going up from 1980 now to 1986. I was in a Baptist church and we had the minister there, and he was a young minister, exactly the same age as I was. There was only 3 months difference. And we used to share the ministry. He would preach and I would preach. And I remember one Sunday getting up, and I can't remember exactly the point I was trying to make, but what I did say is that we weren't Baptists, and I was probably trying to think of ourselves as not following a label. Okay, you get the idea? So I said, there is a sign above our church, and it says Major Road Baptist Church in Stratford, East London. Major Road Baptist Church, Baptist Church. I said, that's just a sign. We're not Baptists. We're born-again Christians who love Jesus. That's what I said. Now, after the service, the minister came up to me. He said, oh, Alan, that was a bit over the top. He said, well, this is a Baptist church. And I said, well, we might have a label above the door, but actually we're not Baptists, we're followers of Jesus. And you know, the difference between the two of us, he was the full-time minister. It was his job, it was his calling. I wasn't a full-time minister. The next day I could, you know, just cheerfully go off to my job in the bank. Can you see that if I had been the full-time minister at that point, would I have said the same thing as I did? Would I? And I had said things when I was preaching, like, you know, and if you don't like it, there's the door. And I can't remember ever saying that as a full-time minister. And what I believe is that in my 20s, if you like, I wasn't ready to be a shepherd of God's people, because I would have told them what to do and where to go. And in a sense, I think I would have had more of the spirit of Peter in the New Testament than of Moses. Now, Peter could not have led a few million people through the desert. No way would he have done that. He wouldn't have had the patience. He would have got more frustrated. You didn't need someone with Peter's personality, who had a sanguine personality, who was an action, up and at 'em type person, to lead a few million Jewish people through the desert. He didn't have the personality. He wasn't the right person. And never would he be. But Moses was. Moses was melancholic. Moses was a bit more down. He was a bit more serious and all that. And you can look it up as to what the melancholic personality is like. So just to sum up this little thought here, is that things may not be happening in your life as you want them to, because it's about timing. It doesn't mean to say God's never going to bring it to pass. What it can mean is that it's not the right time. What it can mean is that you're not ready. It may be as simple as you're not ready. And that's not to do with sin. That's not to do with judgment. God's not paying you back or anything like that. He's not a vengeful, spiteful God in that way. Hallelujah, because of Jesus. But he does hold back, and he does hide, and he does, keep his cards close to him, if you will, until a time when he can reveal his purposes to us. So I hope that helps you to understand why Hannah was barren. She was barren because she was going to bring into the world a special child, and she wasn't ready for that. But what happens as we move on, and this is so easy to miss when you're just reading through the Bible. Most people try and read through the Bible in a year, and I guarantee that if you read through the Bible in a year and you try and get through 3 or 4 chapters a day, this little phrase is something you will guaranteed miss. And it's in verse 9. And so Hannah's, going through all this, can't bear children, being irritated, this, that, and the other. And in verse 9, it says, once when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now, what happens then after she stands up is she meets Eli, and she has a chat with him and she prays. But what is happening inside, it's not what she does on the outside, but what's happening on the inside. Now, the word in Hebrew to stand up is kum. So if you want somebody to stand up in Hebrew, you say kum, kum. Okay, so kum, stand up. And it means to decree, to pitch. Like there's a level of intensity going around. So if we look at pitch as regards of a musical note, a pitch, you can have a very shrill, intense, powerful noise. And perhaps you can have a lower level noise that's not so piercing. So what's happening here? When she stands up, in the Hebrew, she's making a decree. Now, I was looking up my Reader's Digest words, which I love, and making a decree, there is a Latin phrase, or the Latin word is decretum. Decretum. Now, decretum means that it's something you have decided to do. So when she stands up, and she does physically stand up, but her spirit stands up. And she has decided in her heart that she cannot carry on in the way that she's been carrying on in the first 8 or so verses. In fact, it's not 8 or so verses, is it? It's years. She cannot carry on like that. There has to be something different. There has to be something else. And what we might say, you know, in our common parlance of today, is that she's taken it up another notch. She's taken it up another level. And what she does is she begins to pray earnestly. Okay? She begins to pray earnestly. Verse 11, for example. And she makes a vow. Okay, now, we don't read that she made a vow before that, but she makes a vow. O Lord Almighty, if you will only look upon your servant's misery, so she was a miserable person to be around, and remember me, and do not forget your servant, but give her a son. Okay? Then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, etc., etc. And she kept on praying. And Eli doesn't understand, you know, well, I was going to say typical man, but he was a priest, you know, so he probably should have understood. But he doesn't understand. And she says in verse 16, I've been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. And really, just to close, really, because we're getting up to the we're getting up to the half an hour mark. She's been saying things like in verse 15, I'm deeply troubled, pouring out my soul to the Lord. Verse 16, great anguish and grief. And as we've said, she comes to a point where she's had enough. Now, that doesn't mean to say that she gave up, because she quite clearly didn't give up. And if you feel in your heart over any issue that you are at the point where you want to give up, that means I'm not doing it anymore. I'm stopping it. I'm going to stop praying. I'm going to stop asking God for things. She didn't give up and stop. She wasn't defeated. What she did is she took it up another level. She did something that she hadn't done before. And that's what, when she stood up, that's what it means. Now, when I was trusting the Lord for full-time ministry, I would pray. I'd pray at home and others would pray for me, etc. And in the last year, it was probably about the last year or 18 months before I actually went full-time in the ministry, I decided to take it up a notch. So what I did, I was working in the bank at Park Lane, near Hyde Park Corner. Brompton Road, actually, Brompton Road. And there was a park across the road called Green Park. Some of you may know it. And it's near Hyde Park Corner. A very, very busy situation. So every Wednesday, I decided I would fast all day Wednesday. So I didn't have any breakfast. I didn't have any lunch. And during lunchtime, what happened was that I went across to the park and I prayed during my whole lunchtime for an hour or so. And I used to walk around the park and I used to call upon God and say, Lord, I really want to serve you full time. Lord, will you move me on from this bank? Will you change my situation, change my direction? And I would cry and I would plead with the Lord and I would do whatever. Because in my heart, God knew what my heart was. And I believed my heart was being aligned with his heart, which is great, isn't it? Okay. And so that's what I did. I took it up a notch, because before I prayed, but I hadn't fasted. And I'd encourage you, if you've prayed about something, but you haven't fasted about it, fasting will take it up a notch. Fasting will take it up another level. All right? And God will see that. God will see the intent of your heart. and he will, I believe, respond to you in the way that he responded to me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop there, because I could go on and on and on. So we've been about half an hour, and what I want to say to you, I mean, I'll just finish with this little phrase in verse 20. It says, "So in the course of time, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel." Can you see that she didn't get an immediate answer to her prayer? So in the course of time. Now, we don't know how long that time was, but God doesn't necessarily give us an immediate. Sometimes he does. And I've had situations where God's given me an instant answer to prayer. But usually God will continue to try our faith and to stretch us and to see how we go. So in the course of time, she still had to wait for the fulfillment of her praying. And that's something that we have got to understand, that with your difficult situations, you flow with them. You don't necessarily fight against them. You flow with them. And what I find is that Hannah, at the end, to me, it seems that she reaches a place of rest. She reaches a place of rest. She imposes herself on the situation rather than any more allowing the situation to be imposed on her. And I'll just finish with this little illustration. I promise I will finish with this. In the World War I trenches, the soldiers weren't fighting every day by any means. I think they did about a 7-day stint, and then they went off and they had a rest for another 7 or 10 days, and then another group would come in and take their place. Now, when they were in the trenches, they weren't fighting all the time. They might have been in the trenches for 7 days, but they weren't fighting all day, every day. And there'd be lots of times when both sides were not fighting. There was just nothing going on. So what we know that possibly the Germans did the same, but we know that the British Army, they would do things obviously like letter writing, but they would do gardening, and they would do bird watching. Now, they were in a very, very difficult situation, life-threatening. But what did they do? They weren't on the lookout 24 hours a day. Otherwise, they'd just go mad. So they flowed with their situation and thought, well, I'm in this situation. I might as well make the best of it. I'm going to use the situation for my advantage. So in all the down times when they weren't fighting, all the peace times when they weren't fighting, they did some gardening. They did some bird watching. So they did ordinary things, but they flowed with their circumstances rather than going against their circumstances. And that's something that I want to leave with you, really. Whatever situation you find yourselves in, whatever barrenness, and barrenness isn't just about bearing children. You can be barren and you can feel lost and you can feel deserted because you've got no relationship with anyone. You can feel barren in your job. You can feel barren in any situation where you don't feel recognised. You can feel barren because of the COVID situation we've all been in. Whatever barrenness you face, then just look at it with different eyes. Look at it in the sense that, Lord, I'm going to impose myself upon this. I'm going to go with it. I'm going to flow with it. I'm not going to fight against it. So I'll leave that with you. The Lord bless you. And go back to Hannah chapter 1, 1 Samuel chapter 1, and look at the verses and mull some of the things over that I've said. And next week we will look at a little bit more of Hannah's experience. So shalom, the Lord bless you, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.